Hello, everybody. Happy Saturday, and I hope everyone's weekend is going well. I appreciate any of you that may watch this video later and join us right now during this live. We welcome you. We've been on a journey for the last several weeks relooking at children's stories commonly taught for Sunday school age kids and thinking about them in a new perspective. Many of our youth have also been attending church, and so I'm sure that they've also been looking at things a little differently than what they grew up with in Sunday school. It's not that the way we teach kids in Sunday school is necessarily wrong. There is a reason to teach in a very specific manner, but sometimes we let our preconceived notions of what children understand overshadow what we really could be doing to help them learn and grow. And that's been the whole point of this very big series, is to re-examine the way that we once understood certain stories in the Bible and see how maybe something got a little watered down in translation. Last week we finished our journey with Jonah, and this week we're starting to dive into the story of David and Goliath. Now, David and Goliath is a very simple story about a young man who does a very great thing. But many don't see or understand the amount of criticism that young David went through. Most people don't understand who he really was. And a lot of people really don't understand the history of who the Philistines were. When I think of David and Goliath, I feel my inner warrior come out. I love fencing, and when I was introduced to fencing through a friend of mine, and then it became a bigger passion as I became more involved with other trainers, this type of story, this type of young warrior story really, really makes me smile. I think of the many times in my life that maybe I felt like David. I remember a particular fencing tournament that I was in, and it actually was my very first tournament that I competed in. One of the guys that I ended up going against felt like my version of a Goliath. He was a very tall guy and very strong. Although I did not win that fight, I learned a lot in that fight. I learned a lot about my abilities and my willingness to persevere when I felt defeated from the get-go. And as much as that is not like David's battle, there is still a lot that can be said about what David may have felt about himself as he stood up for himself in his journey and really pushed to be understood outside of the very narrow lens that most people understood him in. Thinking back to when I was a kid, I remember learning about David and Goliath. I remember that main message being that even though I was little, I can still do big things. I've always had a love of Veggie Tales. In fact, friends of mine would ride in my car, and this is in my 20s, guys. This is not like younger years. This was in my mid to late 20s. We'd ride around and we would listen to silly songs with Larry. That's just how I was. And there's one silly song that taught me that God is bigger than the boogeyman. Okay? He's bigger than Godzilla or the monsters on TV. Yes, God is bigger than the boogeyman, and he's watching out for you and me. Veggie Tales is good stuff, let me tell you. Really, it does come down to God is bigger than anything we're going to face, even when at the time we can't see that. I want to look now at who the Philistines were before we dive too much into our scripture today, because there's a lot of history that can be learned and understood about the Philistines. I did a lot of research to get a better understanding myself, because even I had a very, very narrow lens of who the Philistines really were. Now, according to biblical tradition, the Philistines came from Caphtor, who settled on the southern coast of Palestine in the 12th century BCE, about the time of the arrival of the Israelites. The Philistines invaded Egypt after destroying Anatolia, Cyprus, and Syria. They eventually settled on the coastal area of Palestine, and they stretched from Joppa south to Gaza. Around 1050 BCE, they had become this superior military organization. They were like, when people thought about who they did not want to battle, it was the Philistines. They'd been able to occupy most of the Judean hill country, and they were constantly in conflict with the Israelites. The conflict over the Canaan territory and religious and cultural differences between the Israelites and the Philistines led to multiple battles between the two nations. In the Old Testament, Philistines are viewed constantly as the bad guys, the long-term enemies of Israel. And from the time this really started from the time they very first encountered each other. We don't really know exactly what caused all of the conflict, other than, unfortunately, the Israelites had enemies all over the place. And unfortunately for the Philistines, they had more than just, the story of David and Goliath and some of their history that gave them a bad name. There are other characters, other individuals within our Holy Scriptures that were also Philistine that aided to this. I think of the story of Samson and Delilah. Now, although Samson was not the best person in the world, Delilah was a Philistine who tricked Samson into finally giving up what gave him his strength, and she caused a lot of damage to young Samson. So, again, there's many examples. But all of these things we need to understand as we dive into the story of David and Goliath. We're going to break down this very short story. This story is only one chapter long. It comes from 1 Samuel chapter 17. But we're breaking it up into a few parts so we can really dive into it and get some different perspectives and maybe start asking ourselves different questions. So today's portion is going to come from, again, the 17th chapter of 1 Samuel. We're only going to be looking at verses 1 through 27. It says, "Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Kokah in Judah. They pitched camp at Damim, between Sokah and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span." We'll get into understanding that measurement later. "He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels on his legs. He wore bronze greaves and had a bronze javelin, which was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted at the ranks of Israel, 'Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us.' Then the Philistines said, 'This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other.' On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time, Jesse was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend to his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistines came forward, and every morning and every evening took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, 'Take the ephah and roast grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines.' Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of the supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brother how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath and the Philistine champion from Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." Saul was the first king of Israel. Now, to give a little context for today's message, we're going to have to back up a little bit. Saul knew who David was. In chapter 16, it even says how Saul really liked David. He really liked David's abilities. And then there was a jealousy of David that kind of grew because he also knew that David was blessed by the Lord. David was not a royal. Okay, David didn't come from a royal line. David was, however, anointed by Samuel, which symbolizes God's recognition and ordination of a person. David was not a very tall person. He was a tiny guy. In fact, his anointing had not been chosen by God because of his physical appearance. Both Samuel and even Saul needed to be reminded of this because there was not necessarily this notion of a king that fit the persona of David's exterior makeup and appearance. But David's heart was the thing that God really loved. The Hebrew concept of heart embodies more than just your emotions. It is everything from your emotions to your will, your intellect, and your desires. After all, the life of mankind will reflect the heart. Now, David was the youngest of his siblings and started his life actually as a shepherd. He would later rule as king. During David's anointings, his ascent to the throne began, which meant that Saul's fall kind of started to happen. An evil spirit ended up taking over Saul, and it began to torment him. So David was this lowly shepherd, and he was also a musician. And because he played the lyre or the harp so beautifully, he was introduced to the Israelites as this royal musician before he would later be introduced as a king. Saul, as I mentioned, was battling these internal demons. So we need to keep that in mind when we go into today's context. Now, moving into today's context of the first 27 verses of this chapter, we need to understand that because Saul was battling these demons, it also gave the Philistines this understanding that it was the perfect time for them to attack. Throughout history, we see it many times in battle or in any type of major conflict that the enemy is going to wait to attack when their opposition is at its weakest. And that's mainly because they're the most likely to succeed at that time. Now, we've got one side occupying one of the hillsides, the other with the other hillside, and then the valley of Elah was right between both hillsides. Because of their past successes, the Philistines were a little cocky and very confident in their weaponry, their strength, and even their leadership. They knew that they were seen as this superior military organization. The Israelites, however, were kind of in the exact opposite position. They were terrified, they were disheartened at this point, and they knew their leader, Saul, was already battling this internal warfare with his own demons. So they also knew that their key leader was not where he needed to be to lead them to victory against the Philistines. So the Philistines were so confident that they nominated just one champion to take out the Israelites. This champion's name was Goliath. He was a man from Gath and was a huge guy in height and weight. But not only was he a huge guy in height and weight, he was a huge guy in ego and pride. Goliath stood, according to our reading, 6 cubits and a span. Now, if we think way back to our Noah journey, we realize that a cubit is 18 inches. A span roughly converts to about 9 inches. So if we do the math, Goliath stood roughly around 9 feet 9 inches tall. That's a tall guy. And when I first did the math and converted it, my immediate thought of trying to even picture Goliath came to thinking about Andre the Giant. I had recently watched a documentary on Andre the Giant. And even Andre the Giant stood around 7'4" or 7'5" in height. So Goliath was a good almost 2.5 feet taller than Andre the Giant. So think of that. And Andre the Giant, depending on who you ask, weighed anywhere from 280 to 550 pounds. Okay, so picture how big and how much Goliath had to have weighed. He was a big guy. They were so confident in Goliath that he was going to fight by himself. They figured he would destroy anything or anyone that got in his way. So not only did they have this much confidence in one person defending their entire army, pretty much, but they also vowed that if someone was able to come and defeat Goliath, they would surrender to the Israelites. However, there was the other side that if Goliath took out the man willing to fight him, then the Israelites had to surrender and serve the Philistines and their military organization. Goliath was so full of himself that he boasted about his nationality while trying to demean the Israelites. He referred to them as just servants of Saul. And no one wanted to fight Goliath. I mean, I'm a person that likes a challenge, don't get me wrong, but if I saw a guy 9 feet tall, over 9 feet tall, pushing 10 feet tall, and I was told, hey, you've got to take this guy out, I'd probably be a little intimidated as myself. Saul was head and shoulders taller than the rest of the people that were not only in his army, but really in his nation. Saul was tall. So not only was Saul, as the king and the leader, terrified, but Saul knew that by all technicality, he should actually be the one to go up against this giant. So for 40 days, Saul waits. 40 days. Now, I want to put a disclaimer in here that when I was planning out when I was going to talk about these stories, I honestly did not realize how many times the number 40 was going to consecutively show up in my preaching. Because Noah, we hear the number 40. In Jonah, the number 40. So now we're going to hear another number 40. So 40 days, Saul waited to see if someone would step up to take on Goliath. And during that 40 days, Goliath was able to bellow out this defiant scream to the Israelites without a response. I mean, everyone was terrified. So now we get into where David comes into play. We need to understand that David, again, is the youngest son of Jesse. His 3 oldest brothers are a part of the military for the Israelites. David was a royal musician. He came and played for Saul very frequently, but then would leave Saul to go and tend to his sheep and worked for his father. David didn't think that because he was technically a royal musician that he, didn't have to do regular chores. There was nothing that was beneath David and his willingness to help with, which is really something that we should all strive to be. There should never be anything beneath us that we are unwilling to do because we think our status is a certain level. David probably thought that he might be going to battle with King Saul just because he was one of Saul's armor bearers. But that didn't happen. Saul actually sent him home. And in many ways, this worked out because David was not one that leaped at every opportunity necessarily. He truly did believe in waiting for divine instruction. And this means that you wait and ask yourself if what you're about to do or try is what God is really calling for you to do. Because David was willing to be sent home, due to the impending battle, he was able to break away from this image of just being a musician. And maybe this would give Saul a chance to later see him with fresh eyes. Maybe he could be seen as a potential warrior. Now, David was a very obedient young man. He not only served King Saul, but he also served his father, like I said. His father ended up sending him to deliver bread and cheese and other things to the army camp where his 3 older brothers were. Little did Jesse really understand, but he was sending his son into something much more dangerous than what he knew. Before David set out from his father's house, he made sure that his sheep were taken care of and protected by another shepherd. And thanks to God's very amusing timing, David arrived at the army camp just as Goliath was set to make out one of his new bellowing calls, his twice-a-day challenge. Goliath constantly incited fear in the others, but David, young David, cracks me up. And it did the opposite to David. Instead of fear, it stirred up David's faith in many ways. And instead of running and hiding, he was left puzzled. He went to check on his brothers and asked how they were doing. And his brothers, he could see, were terrified. So he didn't understand, and he asked questions. Saul was so desperate to find someone to fight that Saul was offering up multiple prizes. The first prize he offered up was a lot of money. Okay? Then Saul offered up his daughter in marriage. Saul was so desperate that he would pretty much let anyone marry his daughter at this point. He was giving up his child in marriage because Saul didn't want to fight this guy, so he was hoping he could talk somebody else into it. And then when that didn't work, Saul then, on top of all of those things, said that you and the rest of your family will be tax-free. You will be tax-exempt. You will not have to pay your taxes. He was hoping that this would be enough for someone to, pretty much tempt their life to fight on his behalf. Saul was so desperate to find someone to fight Goliath that he offered anything he could think of. No matter the prize, no one wanted to take him up. So now this made Saul get even more nervous. They figured whoever went up against this giant was surely going to die. No amount of money, no promise of marriage to the king's daughter, or even freedom of paying taxes was enough for anyone to say, yeah, this sounds like a great idea. Let me do that because I'll come out on top in this situation. Now, although David asked about the prizes when he asked his brother what was going on, he didn't really care about the prizes. David was angry that this Philistine was able to defy the army of the living God. While everyone else saw this terrifying giant, David saw an uncircumcised Philistine who was not in a covenant relationship with God. There was no way that God would defend this man, Goliath, over someone even like David. David saw Goliath as a being that needed to be driven out of the promised land. This guy needed to go. The entire Philistine army needed to go. The Israelites were not merely just the servants of Saul like Goliath preferred to refer them to, but they were the host of the living God. Now, as we continue to study this story, we need to remember to be more like David, being able to see things through the eyes of faith versus the eyes of fear. When we let fear or new things control us, we're telling God that we know better than him and we do not want whatever he has to offer us. The things in this life we decide not to do or try because of fear end up being the things that we later regret in our life. We decide, we need to turn our eyes and our minds and our ears, and like the Hebrews, our entire hearts towards God. God's presence in David's life allowed his eyes to be sharpened. He saw things without blinders on. He didn't see just what was in front of him. He saw the big picture. How many of us can think of a time that we decided not to do something because it wasn't exactly what we were thinking it should be? How many times have we judged somebody because of their size, their age? Maybe for our younger crowd, you didn't try an activity. Maybe you're not joining an organization at school or in your community. Maybe you're not trying something outside your comfort zone because you don't think it's exactly what you think it should be. Maybe our older crowd can think of a time where they chose not to apply for a job or try something because they didn't think they'd be able to handle it or manage it. There's always going to be something that we are called to do that's going to be uncomfortable. But we need to allow God to work within us, to let Him lead, because He will equip us with what we need. It doesn't matter how old we are, our experience level, our size, our strength, our level of courage. We have to remember that we can't look at what the eyes see before we see the invisible. We've got to learn to sometimes to get out of our own way, and to realize that sometimes things are bigger than what we like to paint them as. The picture could be much brighter and much more gorgeous if we would just get out of our own way. I hope you all will join us. I'm sorry again for such a late live stream this week. I'm hoping to actually do a live stream tomorrow or Monday with tomorrow's message. Have a great rest of your weekend, and I will see you soon.